Hello, I'm Dr. Malin Zachau, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share some of my research here with you today. I grew up in Sweden and moved to Christchurch, New Zealand in 2012. I'm an invited member of the New Zealand Backcountry Technical Rescue Advisory Group. I'm a founder member of the New Zealand Society for Mountain Medicine, and I am invited civilian representative of Tactical Medicine New Zealand. My topic today is avalanches in New Zealand. I wish to say thank you to the New Zealand Coronial Information Service, who kindly gave me full access to all their coronial inquest data, and also thank you to Mountain Safety Council, who gave me access to their information exchange observational reports data. I also used the historical data from a PhD paper which is available online. Here I'm showing you the historical variation in New Zealand avalanche fatalities, starting in 1930. Each bar represents a decade. Let's now concentrate on the two blue bars, which is 2000 to 2009 and 2010 to 2019. This shows that with such a small data set, there are quite large fluctuations, and that makes any statistical trends difficult to obtain. However, this is the data we have, and that's what we have to work with. Now, this slide just shows the last 20 years. There's some good years without any deaths. There were 5 years with 3 deaths, and there was that terrible year when there were 7 deaths. The 26 deaths were spread over 17 incidents, one which involved 4 fatalities, one which involved 3 fatalities, 4 which involved 2 fatalities, and there were 11 incidents that involved 1 single death. To provide some international context, I've worked out the avalanche fatality per million people resident in each country. We do not have accurate recreation participation numbers, so this is only a rough representation of the state of affairs, but New Zealand appears to be halfway between Austria and Canada in incidents per capita. The seasonal variation of fatal avalanche incidents is not very great. Apart from skiing, shown in green, and snowboarding, shown in grey, avalanche fatalities are not confined to winter in New Zealand because the permanent snowpack at higher altitude. Now we move on to the activity at the time of fatal incidents. In the last 20 years, there have been no occupational or transport avalanche deaths and none that involve buildings. As you can see, climbers are in the majority with 65% of the deaths. Then come helicopter-aided skiing and tramping, each at 12%, with the remaining activities, skiing, snowboarding and unknown activity at 4% each. To offer some international context, I've analysed 4 other countries' online national avalanche incident repositories. And as you can see, compared to USA, Canada, France and Norway, the very high proportion of climbers being killed in avalanches in New Zealand is quite unusual. We have looked at the fatality data and the activity being undertaken at the time. Before we investigate that further, I'd like to discuss New Zealand's unique challenges, in particular regarding distance, topography, population and resources. New Zealand consists of North and South Island. North Island has mostly subtropical climate and is known for having the Lord of the Rings movie set Hobbiton. Most of the alpine areas are in the South Island, where several mountains peaks in the Southern Alps are higher than 3,000 meters. The tree line is lowering to 900 meters at the bottom of the South Island. In winter, up to 35% of the South Island are snow covered. The permanent snow line is above 1,500 to 2,200 meters. Because the snow line and the tree line tend to coincide, There are rarely any trees in the terrain where one can ski, and thus tree well burials are not a hazard here. The red rectangle on the map is the area where all the avalanche fatalities in the last 20 years occurred. The blue dot is Christchurch, where I live. So New Zealand is often thought of as a small island in the South Pacific, but it's not actually small at all. And hopefully you can see how big we actually are. Now, New Zealand now has a population of 5 million. A third of those live in Auckland in North Island, and North Island has a population of 3.8 million in total. South Island only has just over 1 million. So the green areas of the map show where nobody lives in 1 square kilometre. So South Island is quite empty. So it's big and empty. Now, focusing on South Island, where all the fatalities have occurred, there are 6 emergency services helicopter bases with a total of 9 helicopters. 4 of those 6 bases have paramedics. None of the bases have doctors. There is also 1 professional search and rescue helicopter. That's the Department of Conservation Search and Rescue Team, Alpine Cliff Rescue Team at Araki, Mount Cook. So organised rescue is made challenging by the tyranny of isolation, small population and low number of rescue helicopters per capita. The very quickest a helicopter with paramedic staffing is likely to arrive at an avalanche site is about 30 minutes. But in one of the heli-ski avalanche rescues, it took the paramedic staffed rescue helicopter 50 minutes to arrive. An avalanche search dog team may well be able to arrive more quickly because they get transported by local private heli-ski and scenic flight helicopters. The Alpine Cliff Rescue, Department of Conservation, the professional search and rescue team at Araki, Mount Cook, have helicopters and first aid trained staff that retrieve the casualty from the mountain to their medical base, where they then get transferred to a paramedic staffed rescue helicopter and taken to hospital. Looking back at the map with a red rectangle, where all the avalanche fatalities in the last 20 years have occurred, this is now a more detailed version of that. You can see Christchurch in the top right corner, and you can see Queenstown sort of in the middle. Each star represents a fatal avalanche incident between 2000 and 2019. There were 17 incidents with a total of 26 fatalities. Orange represents tramping, red is skiing, grey is snowboarding, green is heli-skiing, and the blue stars represent climbing. Now the cluster of blue stars are all within the Araki Mount Cook National Park. Now, time to rescue of avalanche fatalities. Maybe it should be time to body recovery, but I think because we, at least in the early stages, we hope that the casualty will be alive. So I'm going to use the term rescue, even though in hindsight we know that all of these patients were dead because they were part of the coronial analysis. So 5 of the people who died were rescued in less than 30 minutes, and that was by their companions. 3 of those were heli-skiers. 1 was a climber who was not buried, and 1 was a climber who had a visual clue on the surface. 8 of the people who died in avalanches were found by organised rescue at between 2 and 2.5 hours. 4 were not buried and 1 had a visual clue. The other 2, one was a solo skier and a solo snowboarder. They were both wearing transceivers, and for the last one, the details are not yet made public. Finally, 7 were found in over 24 hours, ranging up to 17 days, and 3 bodies were never found. So the time taken for organised rescue to find bodies of avalanche casualties is determined not only by the availability of helicopters, snow and weather conditions, but also the extremely treacherous terrain that the climbers are in, and this limits the use of avalanche search dogs. Now, we saw that only 5 people, which represents 19%, were rescued by companions. Now, that might seem like a small proportion, and this is the explanation for that. 19% were solo adventurers, they had no companion. 35% of people who died, they didn't have any surviving companions because the entire party died. And for 19% of the people who died, their companions were too severely injured to help. And there was only 8% where their companions had no equipment or no training and therefore could not rescue. Now, the cause of death, if we look at just the climbers, which is 65% of the fatalities, we can see that trauma and presumed trauma combined is responsible for 71% of cause of death. The climbers who died of asphyxia, which is 18%, did so on more moderate slopes in more forgiving terrain, the slopes being 30-degree angle. Cause of death of the avalanche decedents who were non-climbers, so this was the heli-skier, snowboarder, tramper, and unknown activity. 58% died of asphyxia and 22% of trauma and 11% of hypothermia. Now, there are some limitations to this study and the quality of data is not perfect. The coronial data is incomplete in some aspects. So there was 1 post-mortem not performed and 3 bodies never found. There was 1 person, we don't know what activity they were undertaking at the time. And there were 3 where the locations weren't known. But also the coronial and inquest data doesn't always include the weather and snowpack conditions, and it also doesn't always mention whether or not rescue equipment was carried. If we look at survivors, the reporting inconsistencies are significantly worse because hospital data don't get coded with avalanche, they get coded with the activity undertaken at the time. And the Mountain Safety Council Information Exchange, it's voluntary self-reporting, and we do know that that has been significantly underreported in the past. So, in summary, avalanche fatalities occurred throughout the year in New Zealand. 65% of the deaths occurred amongst climbers, and this is higher than many other countries. And because it's climbers who who have big falls, trauma and presumed trauma was responsible for 71% of deaths of climbers. The climbers who died of asphyxia did so in less steep terrain. And the opportunity for companion rescue was limited by several factors. Organised rescue teams arrived and found avalanche decedents on average in about 2 hours. This concludes the data part of my presentation. I will now move on to where New Zealand is with implementation of ICAR avalanche patient recommendations. The New Zealand Mountain Safety Council publish online avalanche forecasts updated regularly by local observers. The Avalanche Information Exchange, which is self-reported observations, is now anonymised and is being incentivized to try to reduce any elements of underreporting. The Mountain Safety Council also hosts a conference every 2 years where snow industry can learn good international practice. In 2017, a friend and I had the opportunity to run an ICAR avalanche patient checklist simulated patient scenario with 4 different patients, and that was well received. Last year, I had the opportunity to present a mechanical CPR device workshop with 4 different devices, and I also presented my work on accidental hypothermia management and this coronal avalanche analysis. St John's Ambulance is the only ambulance service in South Island, and prior to 2019, their clinical procedure guidelines had nothing about accidental hypothermia or avalanche patients. I was privileged to be able to write the current guidelines, which is now almost ICAR consistent, so that's a good progress. Mechanical CPR devices have not traditionally been deployed in New Zealand, apart from Auckland Rescue Helicopter that's had one for a couple of years. But since June this year, Christchurch now has 30 Lucas mechanical CPR devices, so that's progress. New Zealand Police run multidisciplinary avalanche search and rescue exercises sporadically, and there were some in 2012, and then there were some throughout the country in 2018. The one in the Canterbury area, I had the opportunity to write the patient scenarios for that. The BTRAG, which is the Backcountry Technical Rescue Advisory Group, is a group made up of police, Landsar, Department of Conservation, Alpine Cliff Rescue Teams, Antarctica, New Zealand, and some other technical rescue teams. And they promote and disseminate international good practice within New Zealand. And I'm very privileged to be an invited member on that. What still needs to be done to help improve chances of avalanche patients? So Mountain Safety Council is keen to engage with climbers around avalanche safety with as far as avalanche forecasting, snow and ice conditions, bigger uptake in incident reporting, and also training and equipment regarding transceiver shovel probe and RECO. Companion rescue, first aid training. So the actual transceiver shovel probe is quite well taught to many recreational backcountry skiers, but the first aid training is not available for recreationalists. As far as snow professionals, in 2015, Dom Bogie of the Department of Conservation asked some friends of mine to start delivering that in their training courses. But unfortunately that discontinued in 2018 when that company changed its focus, and currently there's no one delivering that training. And volunteer rescue teams also do currently not receive any avalanche specific first aid training. And that's something that some friends and I are trying to improve on. The chain of rescue. So it's challenged by the fact that there's no peak body that accepts responsibility for the issue in New Zealand. Emergency departments are not at all used to receiving surviving avalanche patients, and they have little, if any, understanding or knowledge of the ICAR checklist. With regards to profound hypothermia, there is no destination policy in the country. And although there is one adult ECMO unit in Auckland, which does offer a retrieval service, they don't currently recognize hypothermia as an indication. So there's still some work to be done. These are my contact details, and thank you very much indeed for listening, and I look forward to any questions and comments. Thank you.